Hi guys, it's Andrea Edwards and welcome back to part 2 of We Need a New Middle Class Dream. And today we are at section 9. Section 9, almost there. Got one more after this. And today we're going to talk about travel and tourism. Please don't hate me for what I'm going to share with you today. I'm presenting the facts, and it's not about making anyone feel guilty about what they've done or what they're doing. It's just about saying we need to change things. So we can't change things if we don't know, right? What's my expertise here? I'm obviously not a person who's an expert in the travel and tourism sector, and I don't claim to be. I've been on the road since the early 90s, traveling the entire world. I've almost been to every continent, so I'm part of the problem. But I've got more than 30 years experience traveling the globe, and I've seen it change dramatically since I first started traveling. I've also lived in one of Asia's top tourist destinations in Phuket, Thailand, for the last 7 years. And I'm just a concerned citizen, so I'm putting a lot of effort into understanding the scale of the problem that we are faced with, and travel and tourism is part of that problem. So let's start talking about travel and tourism. I got on my first international flight from Australia to the Middle East in 1992. And it was incredibly exciting to visit Egypt because I'd studied Egyptology at university and could still read the hieroglyphics, a skill I have long since lost, unfortunately. I'm sure I could get it back. Since 1992, I have travelled the world, and while I always catch trains when I can, offset and do good, I have far exceeded my fair share of the carbon budget. Especially as I recently read that if you fly from London to Sydney or Melbourne return, you are using up an entire lifetime worth of carbon in that one very long, very painful trip, especially if you're at the back of the bus, which I always was. How many times have I done the equivalent? How many times have you? The only difference between those of us who have been able to see the world and those who haven't is the luck of where we were born and when. So how often should we fly if we want to be sustainable? According to the Take the Jump campaign, which I definitely recommend checking out, and they go beyond just flying, they say if we want to be sustainable, that's one short-haul return flight with a destination of 1,500 kilometres or less, and we can do it every 3 years. A long-haul return flight is sustainable once every 8 years, depending on how far you're flying. That's not a lot of flying, is it? So did travel come back in 2023? Well, the whole travel industry is still obsessed with being back to pre-pandemic numbers. And have we achieved that yet? According to the World Travel and Tourism Council, in 2023, the travel and tourism sector contributed 9.1% to global GDP, an increase of 23.2% from 2022 and only 4.1% below the 2019 level. In 2023, there were 27 million new jobs, representing a 9.1% increase compared to 2022 and only 1.4% below the 2019 level. Domestic visitor spending rose by 18.1% in 2023, surpassing the 2019 level. And international visitor spending registered a 33.1% jump in 2023, but remained 14.4% below the 2019 total. So we're not far off where we were before the pandemic, and expectations are we will be back this year, or at least by 2025. This is what the overall growth, including the massive pandemic dip, looks like in a graph from 1950 to 2023. As you can see here with that big dip, the number of international tourist arrivals worldwide increased in 2023 compared to the previous year. The pandemic saw numbers declining to roughly 407 million in the first year of the health crisis, the lowest figure recorded since 1989. In the meantime, global inbound tourist arrivals showed strong signs of recovery in the following years, totaling just under 1.3 billion in 2023. This is what the future growth scenarios look like, breaking out travellers by region. Blue is Asia Pacific, dark blue Africa, grey is the Middle East, burgundy is Europe, green is North America, and gold is Latin America. All are growing, but we can see the enormous jump in Asia. If we really want to understand the extreme levels of growth, I think this image really lays it out. Are we really going to end up there while the industry remains completely unsustainable? To give you a sense of growth, we had 2 billion passengers in 2004, 3.8 billion in 2016, and by 2035, it's expected to reach 7.2 billion, which is, of course, another doubling. Then again, the Airports Council International, or ACI, have said global passenger traffic is expected to recover by 2024 to reach 9.4 billion passengers. So honestly, I don't know who's right here. The data on this sector is wide and varied, and I had to work really hard to find data. And I tried to find data that was replicated in other reports, but the data all points in one direction regardless, and that is growth. According to the research from Statista, which I just showed you, by 2050, approximately 5.85 billion passengers will travel by air just in the Asia Pacific region. The top 5 travel countries for growth, international and domestic, are China, India, the US, Brazil, and Indonesia. So the frequent flyers are really changing, as I'll show you in a moment. Here's another view on growth projections from the International Council on Clean Transportation. The strongest growth predictions, so that's, what is it, sort of like a purple burgundy line, shown here is 800%. And that's obviously the highest of the 3 options that they've given us. But again, another case of massive growth. When we look at today's figures, who flies the most? According to this data from World Atlas, the Finns top the chart with 7.5 total trips undertaken per person per year. The Finns are followed by the United States at 6.7, while the Swedes have 6 trips in total, the Danes 5.5, Norwegians 5.2, residents of Hong Kong and New Zealand 4.3 trips apiece, Canadians 4.1, Australians 3.8, and the French 3.5. What's going on here is the balance is shifting, as we discussed earlier, and the vast majority of countries that will be in this list in the future are countries in the Asia Pacific region, with 1 in Latin America, and of course the US will stay there. But let's have a look at a famous Asian tourist destination for where it is post-pandemic. I'm currently living in Thailand, so let's have a look at tourism figures here, which is from Krungsy Research. This is a sector the government is very focused on rebuilding after a disastrous pandemic for the whole country. I'm in Phuket, and it was devastating for the local community and businesses. It was really, really heartbreaking to see so many people suffer so much. So this is looking at it from the Thai airline industry over 2024 to 2026. So first up, combined arrivals and departures should grow by 13 to 15% per year to reach 168 million in 2025, which is larger than the 2019 total of 165 million. By 2026, it is estimating 179 million departures and arrivals. As I'm sure you probably know, Thailand is among Asia's top destinations according to the travel industry trends for 2023. The total number of flights is expected to rise by an average of 10 to 20% annually, and having been cut during the pandemic, fleet sizes will expand again as demand strengthens. From 2024 onwards, 9 new airlines offering both passenger and cargo services are expected to enter the market too. Krungsy Research sees domestic flights returning to normal in 2024, while international routes will stabilise in 2025. Air freight volume is expected to grow by 3 to 5% per year over the next 3 years. The domestic air freight market will benefit from the development of the infrastructure needed to facilitate transshipping using road, rail, and sea, and this will then support an expansion in the options available for goods freight. An ongoing expansion in e-commerce sales is expected, with Euromonitor seeing the Thai e-commerce industry enjoying an average annual 16% expansion over 2024 and 2025. In particular, using air cargo services for the delivery of food and express parcels is increasingly popular. You might think this isn't necessarily tourism related, but of course it is, but also it will be for things like fast fashion deliveries. And number 4, prices for Jet 1 aviation fuel will likely remain high on the back of the ongoing war in Ukraine and the move by the OPEC Plus group of the world's major oil producers to accelerate output, which will keep crude prices elevated. Total consumption of aviation fuel is expected to reach 12 to 15 million litres a day in 2024 and 16 to 19 million litres a day in 2025 and 2026. In 2019, the level was 16.5 million litres per day. So we're getting back close to that. And of course, this is just Thailand. Every country will have similar data, especially the world's top tourist destinations, and it's all reflecting growth. Another crazy story, and this time it is in India, which is on the front lines of climate change. I saw an announcement that caught my attention last year. It was at the Paris Air Show in 2023, and the Indian carrier Indigo made a record order for 500 Airbus A320 aircraft. It is the largest single purchase agreement by any airline in commercial aviation history. The deal is worth approximately $55 billion. We can't keep growing the way we are growing. We need to scale everything down and focus on building our transportation around sustainability. India can and should be leading the way in developing the world's best train infrastructure. And this matters because another piece of news that got my attention, but this time it was back in 2021, was this article in The Guardian. Planes sold by Airbus in 2019 and 2020 will produce well over 1 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide during their lifetimes. Airbus sold a record 863 planes in 2019, and remember, this was before the pandemic, and this translates to 740 million tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent produced over a 22-year period. So a plane today is in action for 22 years. These figures highlight the scale of the challenge of decarbonisation for both Airbus and Boeing. Another critical point about flying is the contribution towards emissions in this sector is often underestimated, with many believing it's only 2% of all total emissions when it's actually closer to 5%. And of course, CO2 isn't the only issue here. Planes pollution includes CO2, of course, nitrous gases, water vapor, soot, sulfate, and particles, which all impact our global weather patterns and pollution levels. And remember, as we look at growth predictions, if it remains at 5% while experiencing this rapid growth, everything else is growing dramatically too. So don't be reassured by small numbers that don't change over time. Doesn't mean it's getting less or it's not growing. We have to be concerned when we know the industry is growing so rapidly and the number doesn't change because everything else is growing rapidly too. So that's just a bit of a heads up. People don't often talk about that. But are flights the worst contributors? Well, according to this data, cruise ships are the worst, with short-haul flights coming in a close second, a very close second. And for those road trippers, and I love a good road trip, if it's in a diesel or petrol car, they both rank third and fourth. But that gives you a sense. The best thing you can do by this is catch the Eurostar. The trains are a really great way to get around. So let's have a talk about cruising, which is a growing industry. I've been on one. It was the worst holiday of my life. I'll never do it again, but I do appreciate that a lot of people enjoy a cruise. We started the year with the launch of the largest cruise ship in the world, and I have to tell you, for me, this looks like a nightmare. I included an article in the Weekend Reads. A writer went on its first maiden voyage, and it was an absolute nightmare, and I could completely relate to it. This launch got lots of media attention, but it also got greenwashing attention because gas is not a sustainable fuel, no matter how you cut it. In fact, more and more research is coming out around how harmful gas actually is. Number 3, apparently 1 in 4 Aussies are going on a cruise in 2024. So the environmental message is obviously not cutting through. Number 4, in Venice, Bruges, Dubrovnik, Amsterdam, Dublin, Santorini, Barcelona, and many more, they are all looking to limit, stop, or cancel cruise ships. Across these and other cities, especially in Europe, the local community is rising up and saying no more. In Barcelona, a member of the last administration compared cruise passengers to a plague of locusts who devour the public space and leave. Barcelona alone witnessed a total of 4.4 million tourists, of which 3 million were cruise passengers. But it's not just Barcelona. Other Spanish ports are at risk as well. A recent study by the European Federation for Transport and Environment said Mallorca has the second worst pollution caused by cruise ships in Europe after Barcelona, which is making local residents leave the neighbourhood. And of course, it's not just Europe. In the Caribbean and across the Pacific, ecosystems are being destroyed wherever cruise ships show up. So what's so bad about cruises? Well, according to Friends of the Earth, cruise ships are a catastrophe for the environment. And that's not an overstatement, their words. The environmental impact is growing as the ships grow. And where they once were small, they can now hold 9,000 people, and they pollute everything in their path. Everything cruise ships come into contact with are likely to be harmed. Air, water, fragile habitats, coastal communities, and wildlife are all affected, and governments are refusing to take action to regulate the industry. Carnival Corporation is the biggest cruise company and the most notorious for environmental impacts. To give you a flavour, they've been charged with dumping food mixed with plastic waste in Bahamian waters, falsifying records of environmental compliance plans, illegally releasing over 500,000 gallons of sewage and 11,000 gallons of food waste globally, illegally discharging oily waste off the coast of England, illegally dumping thousands of gallons of wastewater into Glacier Bay National Park in Alaska. Not a very good record. There are many other players in the cruise business, with the other big ones including Disney Cruise Lines, Royal Caribbean, which is second only to Carnival for its environmental impact, and MSC Cruise, all are contributing to negative environmental impacts. And a reminder, ships are still burning heavy fuel, dumping waste into waters, still refusing to fully convert to truly green initiatives like shore power, and still destroying local ecosystems with more destruction in the plans. They do not have a positive impact on the environment anywhere they go. That's the bottom line, according to Friends of the Earth. And from my experience and what I've seen, I agree with them. I know this is a very ugly graphic, but getting worldwide data on the cruise industry is actually something that I spent hours looking for, even resorting to AI, and it couldn't help me either. The data just seems to be hard to find, but this is an example tripling. That's massive, massive growth from the year 2000. And as we can see in these headlines, the growth is not stopping, and all of these countries will experience what many of the early cruise line destinations experienced. Throngs of people in short bursts in their communities and what that means. Shops springing up to sell what tourists want, including lots of plastic bottles of water and useless tourist junk, which is often also single-use plastic. The natural area, which made their home a perfect pick for a cruise, will slowly degrade, and there will be no natural environment left. Pollution in the harbours and energy drains on the community And while all this happens, local economies will become so dependent on the income and jobs created from cruise tourism, they will need to keep this business running in their countries because economy and jobs matter more in the short term than the long-term stability of the environment that sustains life. It is definitely a paradox. If you live in an area where they're talking about bringing in cruises, maybe you want to be on the team that fights against it. Obviously, travel is not just about flying or cruising. It's about building more hotels, more roads, bigger airports, more boats on the seas, more tourists who can't swim, destroying precious marine habitats, more selfies in beautiful landscapes where human feet should never walk. It's more, and it seems intent to keep on growing. So let's take a look at growth in sectors that benefit from the travel and tourism sector. There are 17.5 million guest rooms and 700,000 hotels and resorts today, depending on which data you use. And there's a lot of variety here. And I'll show you what that looks like next. The global hotel industry is expected to grow at 8.1% and reach 1.27 trillion, which is 20% higher than the 1 trillion 2020 average, according to Statista. Airbnb, which we spoke about in the housing section, has over 7 million active listings in more than 200 countries. 394 million nights and experiences were booked on Airbnb around the world in 2022. Airbnb has had over 1.5 billion guest arrivals since it started in 2007. The global recreational boat market is expected to reach an estimated 26 billion by 2030, with a CAGR of 6.2% from 2024 to 2030. The major drivers for this market are rising tourism worldwide, growing interest in outdoor recreational activities, and of course, water sports. The global bus market was valued at 50 million in 2022 and is expected to reach 79 million by 2028. Just as I'm doing this, looking at those figures for the bus market, 50 million to 79 million, when other sectors are in the billions. I'll go and check that again. I didn't get the numbers wrong. It just seems incredibly low when you think about the global market for buses. Anyway, always good to check your data, which I do thoroughly. Just seems really low, don't you think? Anyway, the canoe and kayak market is projected to reach 872 million in 2029, increasing from 735 million in 2022. That's what I mean. The kayaks are up at 730 million. Buses at 79 million. I don't know. And finally, the global taxi market size was valued at 203 billion in 2022 and is poised to grow from 230 billion in 2023 to 618 billion by 2031. So that just gives you a sense of all of these other different aspects that we see in the travel and tourism space. It's not just flying, it's not just cruises, it's hotels, and it's all the other things that we enjoy while we're on holiday. So it's to give you a flavor. And maybe the bus market data is wrong, but the point is everything is growing substantially. Let's look at the luxury hotels market size, which was estimated at 11 billion US in 2020 and is expected to reach more than 14.5 billion US by 2028. That's officially 28% growth from 2020 to 2028. Doesn't seem too crazy as a number, but it's definitely not what I'm seeing on the ground. Maybe I'm just unlucky enough to be living in a holiday paradise construction zone right now. The major players in this sector are Intercontinental Hotel Groups, Jumeirah International, Starwood Hotels and Resorts, Kerzner International Resorts, Four Seasons Holdings, Shangri-La International Hotel Management, ITC Hotels, Marriott International, Mandarin International, and the Indian Hotels Company. And of course, there are many, many, many more, but they're the big global players. Here's another growth area relevant to travel. My lovely husband brought me a Rimowa suitcase years ago, and honestly, it was always so bad, even with its lifetime warranty, it became a hassle getting it repaired. So I've left it sitting in a cupboard for years because the other issue is it's also very heavy, and that's a challenge when traveling in countries like Australia and the US. So we keep going back to Samsonite because it just works, and the exclusivity of Rimowa is hardly exclusive anymore especially in Asia, where every luggage belt is full of Rimowa suitcases. But it's another growth area to factor in because when you travel, you need a suitcase or a bag. And the global rolling luggage bag market size was 16 million in 2021 and is projected to reach 32 million by 2031. That's 102% growth, so another doubling. What else do we need to travel? And when you think it through, it's beyond suitcases, travel bags, computer bags, toiletry bags, clothes, swimsuits, hiking shoes or flip-flops, depending where you're going, coats for colder environments, and on it goes. All growing as 3.8 billion middle-class people can take to the skies and see our world. And the overwhelm is real as famous tourist sites get swamped with more and more tourists, which means more and more infrastructure pushing out the locals, including their ability to grow food or afford homes. Recently, the Canary Islands have become the centre of this story. We've seen it with the cruise lines, but the recognition of this explosive growth of the tourist industry is growing by the day, and we are finally witnessing a pushback on unsustainable tourism. In the Canary Islands, 50,000 people came out asking for a freeze on visitor numbers, arguing that the decades-old model has made life unaffordable and environmentally unsustainable for residents. We're hearing of chefs and waiting staff living in cars because they can't afford to pay rent. Organisers of these protests claim the balance between the use of resources and the welfare of the population has broken down, especially over the past year. The protests aren't against tourism, but it is against the unlimited growth of tourism. I live in one of the world's great tourist destinations, and exactly the same thing is happening here. Rapid growth of tourism, destroying the environment, roads unable to cope, water running out, massive groups of tourists everywhere. It's a real nightmare, especially in the high season. But of course, there's no protests here. Last year, 13.9 million people visited the Canary Islands, which has a local population of 2.2 million. Tourism accounts for 35% of the area's GDP, but local people say the industry is stressing natural resources and pricing them out of the rental market. Where I am, tourism is approximately 90% of GDP, which meant a significant amount of suffering during the pandemic. And here we are post-pandemic, and it's roaring again with 8.4 million tourists in 2023. How can the environment keep sustaining those sort of numbers, and how can it sustain even more numbers than that? Figures from Spain's National Statistics Institute show that 34% of people in the Canaries are at risk of poverty or social exclusion, the highest proportion for any region except Andalusia. Like Phuket, the Canary Islands are suffering water supply issues, and a water emergency has already been declared on Tenerife, yet the government is still pushing tourism, which includes building new mega resorts. Locals want a tourist moratorium and a study done to understand how many tourists each island can take. They already believe we're past a critical point, so it's time to see a stage of degrowth of economic activity to benefit natural resources. So this is a big story. Keep an eye out for it, and let's wish those local people success. So what are some of the biggest issues that we face in the tourist sector? And I'm not going to have everything here, but let's just use it as a taster, as a starting point. The first significant challenge is the widespread ecological destruction on both land and in the water. Across the world, environments are depleted, and when you hear of successes like closing down Maya Bay in Thailand, which gave it a chance to come back to life, and it did come back to life, the sharks came back, we need to be doing this everywhere, giving our land and our waters a chance to heal and keeping humans away from it. We really need to start doing that. Number two, the waste crisis is huge, especially on remote islands. The waste crisis is a massive issue everywhere. And as we all seek to go out there and visit these exclusive paradises, the problem is many of them do not have effective waste disposal. So it gets dumped in the environment, or it's burnt, and it often ends up in the ocean. Unsustainable tourism is a massive issue as growth is the only measure we value. We can't keep growing the way we are growing. Everyone can't be out there seeing the world at the same time. It's just unsustainable. The social impact making life hard for the locals, as we saw in the Canary Islands, this is not exclusive to them. Major cities to island paradises are being overrun, and it makes life terrible for the locals, including pricing them out of the ability to even live in their own homes. Over-extraction of nature, creating issues like water emergencies. The tourist industry is taking too much from the local environment, and the impact is felt by those living there the most. Excessive water extraction is one issue impacting locals. We're experiencing it where we are ourselves. But it's not just water to drink or wash with, it's also taking water away from agriculture, which makes survival harder for those living there. We need to reorient tourism where local needs are the biggest priority and have tourism at an appropriate level that enhances and doesn't diminish the life of the local people. Of course, destruction of pristine natural environments. There's a story of Disney Cruise Lines taking over a pristine island, which will guarantee its destruction. But another more recent example is about Jared Kushner, who has plans to build luxury homes and resorts by Europe's last wild river. Located in Albania, it is considered the jewel of the Adriatic and contains an abundance of rare animals and habitats. Jared Kushner and his cronies are planning a series of massive coastal tourist developments with hotels and luxury villas accommodating up to 1 million visitors arriving annually, as well as a new international airport, which is already being built on salt marshes around the lagoon. This sort of activity has got to stop. If it's pristine, we have to keep it that way and then try and heal all the other harm we have done. Greed has been our god for too long, right? Emissions from travel, wherever we go, we create emissions, and the further we fly, the more we create. Mismanagement of local resources becomes unsustainable. We talked about water, but agriculture to serve tourists is also part of the problem. And while the big hotel brands can source food from far away, locals are left with nothing. And worse, the agricultural heritage of areas is being destroyed to make space for more hotels and resorts. Local pollution is a big issue. We talked about the cruise ship pollution, but there's also boats, cars, buses, and so much more. And right now, there's water trucks on the road 24/7 filling up wells. We have cranes, construction trucks. We have all sorts of stuff on these roads. And they're 2-lane small roads that aren't built for heavy equipment like that. But they also release a lot of pollution. The more vehicles we have on the roads and on the water, the more pollution, including sound pollution from the boats, which impacts life in the water. Extreme weather event impacts, fire, flood, heat. We saw tourists fleeing for their lives in the Greece wildfires. We saw tourists in Europe struggling with extreme heat too in 2023. And this is something that will only grow. The impacts of extreme weather events are coming for us all. We need to think through when are the good times to travel, while appreciating that nothing is consistent anymore. So past data cannot necessarily predict the future. My mother-in-law, Tris, hi Tris, she always listens, recently returned from visiting family in Dubai and was caught up in the floods, as well as the chaos at the airport, but thankfully she got her flight home. I welcomed her to the Extreme Weather Event Travel Survival Club, and many of us are now members of that club. I think it's going to be the fastest growing club in the world if we don't get a handle on this. And the final one, obnoxious travelers. Don't we love them? Now, this has been an issue I've watched grow since getting on the road in the early 90s. There is little respect for other travelers, especially these days with influencers taking up public space en masse everywhere. I was actually happy to see Europe the last time I was there tackling this and saying no more, but in Asia, it's not going anywhere. And if you're sitting at a restaurant on the beach in Asia, just look in any direction and you'll see what I mean. There are influencers parading around the beaches everywhere. I find it extremely obnoxious. While I appreciate that these ladies are trying to earn a living. But we also have obnoxious travelers, and that can be culturally obnoxious, or maybe they have high status, which people on cruise lines do, which that article I was talking about in the Atlantic talks about that. And these obnoxious travelers act like it everywhere they go. And they just have no respect for other people, and they're constantly interfering in other people's holidays. As an example, they have their phones on loud in restaurants, on beaches, and pretty much everywhere. I find it awful and completely disrespectful. I just don't understand it. I don't want to hear anybody else's digital noise. I'm very conscious of my own and make sure that nobody is ever around me if I listen to something in a public place. Please help me tell them to put headphones in or shut it down if they're in public. It's just wrong. It's just bad etiquette. I don't understand. How are we here? The problem with this type of traveller is it's driving tourism farther and farther afield as people want to escape these sort of people. And that means tourism will keep having a wider negative impact on our beautiful planet. So let's get the obnoxious and annoying tourists under control, and let's not go to places that are untouched by human beings at this stage. We need to protect all of the wild and beautiful parts of the world that we haven't managed to screw up yet. So what are our options here? And the obvious first place that we have to start is we have to start to look at seriously scaling this industry down. And every country on this planet should do a study to understand what is the reasonable number of tourists in regards to the impact on both the local society and the environment. The grow, grow, grow mentality is suicidal, and we're just hitting peak unsustainable tourism in so many parts of the world, and everyone's had enough. Let's get it under control. If there's any example of the grow, grow, grow mentality being negative for all of us, the travel and tourism industry is certainly one. We can't keep growing the way we are growing. We just can't. You know, this growth mentality, it's suicidal for the countries pushing this narrative and the businesses seeking to exploit every natural place on our planet. It is time to stop and focus on sustainable tourism everywhere. This sector brings many impacts, not just emissions, including biosphere degradation on land and in the rivers and seas, excessive waste, water supply issues, more tourism vehicles, bigger airports and hotels, more boats on the water, and on we go. How about we pay more every time we fly? A reverse of the frequent flyer points. I have benefited from the frequent flyer program for many years, but I am being rewarded for polluting our planet. How about we flip it on its head and tax travellers with every flight costing more? The first flight is market value, which means people who've never been on a plane before can afford to get on their first plane. And then after that, it increases every time you get in the air, with the money raised going into a central global environment fund for the world, with spending focused on developing nations adapting to climate change. I think that would be a fair thing, don't you? This option, of course, means those with money can still travel, but at least we're now really contributing to investment in our beautiful planet. Less than 20% of people in the world have ever flown, and only 5 to 10% of the world's population flies in any given year. So surely those who have this privilege should start paying for the impact of that privilege. We've got to address the aerospace industry, and I know there's lots and lots of problems going on there, especially with Boeing. But I would love to see a global moratorium stopping all planes being manufactured until planes are made and flown sustainably. Aerospace engineers are very, very clever people. I've known many of them in my life. So let's give them this challenge. Besides, I think if we did this, the executives would certainly be motivated to find successful solutions if we put a stop on the industry until it did. I know this isn't going to happen, but if we want to tackle the challenges that we've got in the world right now, this is actually the sort of actions that we need to take. So while it might sound far-fetched, it's actually a pretty reasonable sort of thing that we need to be looking at doing right now. That's where we are. At this point, we should be looking to cap the numbers of planes we have full stop, because we can't just keep growing the way we are growing, especially as we are at such a critical point in climate escalation. This is definitely an industry that needs to stop massively expanding. And besides, we've got to do something serious here. Keeping Wall Street happy with successful growth year on year is not in humanity's or nature's interests. How about we put that first? Cruise ships as an industry has never cleaned up its act and continues to expand across the world. Are we going to let this continue? Will the nations and cities pushing back be enough to finally help this sector address its impact and seriously do something about it? Or is it time for this whole industry to go? Essentially, is it a bullshit industry? I think it is. I know you people love their cruises, but we've got to look at the big picture here. Jobs are on the line, and of course, we need to think this through. Not only does the travel and tourism sector contribute 10% to global GDP, it employs 320 million people across the world, and these jobs lift people out of poverty. It is an important employer, and we need to focus on making sure jobs are safe and that employees can live in their own homes or cities and not be pushed out by the industry that they serve, as we've seen in the Canary Islands. But it can be an endless growth cycle, employing more and more, and we need to be putting limits here while protecting local workers. On cruise ships, the employees are paid very little and work very, very hard because they are often from developing countries like the Philippines, and cost cutting is the name of the game in big business, regardless of the impact on the people. So it's time to make this a much fairer industry. Business flights are coming back from the pandemic and are an important earner for the airline industry. It's a real money spinner for them. However, surely this is the easiest way for companies to reduce emissions, where they significantly reduce flights for their employees. We need to tackle this in a really big way, but of course it's challenging because nothing beats face-to-face. We all know that. Then again, we are in an existential crisis and it's time to face it. I've worked for big global companies who fly employees across the world for mega events. It's a great bonding activity and I understand its value, but we can see where the world is headed with extreme weather events, extinction events, biosphere collapse, and on I could go. We either take this seriously or we don't. We've got to embrace the alternatives, trains, buses, trams, and beyond. If you live in a country that is not seriously investing in public infrastructure like trains, then your country is not getting ready for the future. We need cars and polluting vehicles off the roads, and we need to rip up the tarmac if we want to reduce heat and the impact of weather extremes like flooding. Many countries across the world privatized this infrastructure in the last few decades, making it expensive, inefficient, and a last preference for travel. This must be switched around. If you want to look for a leader in Europe, France is leading the way, China too, although it's also investing in polluting infrastructure. Just a decade ago, China was building a new airport every single week. Whatever we can do to reduce emissions, we need to get determined about it and rebuild the infrastructure needed to succeed. And we also need to make sure it's publicly owned again. Number 8, it's time for the ultra low cost airlines to go or transform. One of the biggest drivers in travel was the emergence of discount airlines like Ryanair and many others. This business model put people on planes in massive numbers where you could pay practically nothing for short flights, but it's driven a surge in cheap tourism that is adding to the emissions problem of this industry. It can no longer be part of the equation. I know this sucks for a lot of people, but we have to look this truth in the eye. Flying much less has to be the goal. Anything that is opposite to degrowing this explosive sector needs to be addressed. Number 9, of course, we obviously need to tackle the private jet frenzy. Celebrities who use private jets, even for short flights, emit an average of more than 3,376 metric tons of CO2, which is roughly 480 times more than an average person's annual emissions. Taylor Swift topped the celebrity list with her private jet emissions equivalent to all the emissions from the energy used by over 1,000 homes in the US for a year. It is time for private jets to go, but we do need an alternative option for high-profile people to travel, especially those doing important work that is valuable in the world. let's start with the bulk of private jet owners who contribute practically nothing to the good of the world. I think we should be looking at establishing permission if you want to fly a private jet, and it needs to be justifiable. So here's just some things that we can be thinking about. Obviously, we could be looking at lots of other areas. One example, of course, is golf courses, especially if they're in countries that are suffering from water shortages. A tiny percentage of the population use golf courses, so water should not be going to maintain them. We also have mega yachts, which we've obviously been hearing a lot about, Jeff Bezos's yacht, all other types of boats. If it keeps on growing, we're going to be doing great harm to marine life. And of course, space flights. We can't do that right now. We have to fix this right now. We have to face the problem we've created on Earth. Mars isn't going to come to our rescue. It's just not. And we've also got to tackle the desperate waste situation that is a huge part of the travel and tourism sector. And we've got to get the waste out of the system. And we've got to make sure the infrastructure is in place everywhere to collect and dispose of the waste or reuse the waste in a sustainable way. So what would you add to this list? All right, and now we are at the what can you and I do about it bit. So we're almost at the end. As challenging as it is, we need to massively reduce the global impact of this sector. And that means all of us flying significantly less and rethinking our whole addiction towards travel and tourism. I know this is a painful truth for many, and I could easily come across as a hypocrite because I got to enjoy it because I was born in the right place at the right time, and things have changed a lot since I first got on the road. But regardless, we've got to look at where we are today, and it can't keep growing the way it is growing. We have to shrink our impact everywhere, and this is a big one, unfortunately. Number 2, until a credible travel tax is in place, when you travel, give generously to environmental organisations, and that means way above what you're being asked to donate through the airline portals. A couple of dollars ain't going to cut it. If we can afford to fly, we can afford to make a contribution where it matters. Plant trees, fund social justice action, pay for fruit trees to be planted in Africa, pay for education or solar panels for poor communities. Do something big to justify your travel and emissions impact. I really do recommend B1G1, which is B1G1.com, and you can set up an account and you can start donating all over the world to fantastic causes that have been verified and are doing really amazing work. Number 3, if you've enjoyed a lifetime of travel like I have, it's time to pay it back. This is something I've been committed to for a very long time. I can't take back the impact I've had, but I can make big contributions towards organisations that are doing positive work in the world, both socially and environmentally. It's also a reason I speak up about the issues. I am doing this because I have been part of the problem, and now I must be part of the solution because the impact of my actions and others like me is first hitting the poorest people in the world. I've travelled the poorer parts of the world extensively. I've met and been inspired by the people in every country I've visited. Now I need to do something right and give back in every way I can. Please join me. It's not just about donating money, it's also about speaking up and helping to educate our community around these issues. It's very, very important. We've got to get the word out. Let's start thinking about the impact of weekend city breaks abroad, which is popular in Europe and Asia. We can't travel sustainably like on a train, and we know how polluting these short-haul flights are. Can we refocus and holiday in the incredible places that we have closer to home? These can offer the same relaxation and fun with none of the stress of international travel. Of course, if we can, always try and travel by train, but whatever we do, let's limit any contributions we make to the climate crisis, and unnecessary flying is definitely a good place to start. Is adventure travel or off the beaten track travel good? This is something we need to be talking about. I was invited on a trip to Antarctica just over a year ago, and I would have loved to have gone. I really would have. But as I said, I've reduced my travel to only necessary since before the pandemic. And when I reflected on it, I just couldn't justify going to Antarctica. nor can I go anywhere else that is untainted by humanity. Unfortunately, as unsustainable tourism grows, this sector is growing too, and there'll be no place left on Earth where humans are not. Wherever humans go, we leave an impact behind, from Iceland to the Himalayas to Antarctica. Perhaps we just need to start saying no and leave the beautiful, untouched parts of the world alone. Do you agree? Number 6, should we be looking at introducing quotas? If we can get countries to jump on board and do a proper assessment of how many tourists can visit while not overshooting the local environment, perhaps this will happen naturally. But we should all be pushing for it. Number 7, take your trash home. So one of the areas most don't really sort of see is what is left behind by tourists. And this is even worse in developing nations, which happen to have stunning, beautiful tropical paradises. As every paradise is discovered, it starts to get trashed because effective waste management is never put in place. So whatever waste we create on these tropical paradises, it gets dumped in the environment, in the sea, or it's burnt, releasing toxins. If you have the privilege of traveling to a beautiful tropical paradise, take an extra case and fill it with your waste. I'll tell you one thing it's going to stop you doing. It's going to stop you from creating waste in the first place. But one of the important things to also return is bottles. If there is rubbish boats collecting waste, bottles are really heavy. So if you can just drink from cans and then take them back. But if you can do it, take it home and get it sorted there, especially if you come from a developed country with waste infrastructure. Then again, a lot of those countries are also shipping their waste back to these parts of the world too, right? So let's take our waste. It's about making a point and taking a stance. And we've got to be conscious to stop trashing paradise and take responsibility for our actions. People think they've got the right to create waste because they're spending so much on their holidays, but it's not how it works. And my experiences living in this part of the world for the last 7 years, I've really, really seen this up close, and it's just ending up in the oceans, and it's terrible. Islands can't cope with the trash. If you're not on the mainland, take it home, or at least take it back to the mainland and put it in the trash there. It's just something that we can all do. Number 8, I really want to recommend that everyone starts doing this. I'm seeing lots of people in my community getting stuck in various situations. We are in a new weather era, and there is much we cannot know before we head off. But if you look at the past 2 years and understand what has happened, as well as which weather pattern existed at the time, so El Nino or La Nina is an example, as well as what time of year, you might be able to miss getting caught up in an extreme weather event that puts your life and your family's life at risk. As an example, it's the hot season in the global south right now, and where I am, it is extremely hot. Bangkok is facing 52 degrees Celsius wet bulb temperatures at the moment, completely deadly. In Phuket, it got to 46 degrees Celsius wet bulb temperatures today. These are deadly temperatures. So it's not a good time to come and visit when those sort of temperatures are hitting. So know when the heat extremes typically happen. And, you know, the hot season is standard in the global south. This is the month, April, May, June, when the real heat extremes start to hit, but it's been hot since February. So know what you're dealing with and work out if it's a good time to come and visit at that time of year. Dry areas experiencing drought, and with a short or long history of wildfires, it's probably best to avoid during the hot seasons, as we saw last year, all of those tourists escaping in Greece, right? So to just start paying attention to what's going on and then make the right decisions for your family about when's the right time to go and where is the right place to go and what's the place you can go without creating emissions. That's another good question to ask yourself. So there you go. There's some things that we can do. There'll be many, many more. And if you've got any ideas, I'd love to hear them. I don't have all the answers. None of us do. I'm just trying to think through what can we do here? How can we do better by our Earth and by the 50% of the world's population who are going to suffer the most based on the 50% of the other side of the population who are enjoying all of these extravagances that are putting all of us at greater risk. All right. Thank you so much for joining me. Number 9 in the series. And the next one is the last for part 2, the waste crisis, something I am personally extremely passionate about. I want to remind everyone that these presentations are imperfect, as I'm basically putting them all together in a week and researching widely across the different issues to make sure I can present the best data available. And the travel and tourism industry data was extremely challenging to find, I can assure you of that. So it means it's not in a perfect flow. And I know sometimes it might come across as a bit repetitive, or I might stumble and stutter over my words. So I hope you can forgive that. As I can honestly say, this is the most intense process I've ever gone through. And the fact that I'm already in my 3rd month of doing it, which was definitely unexpected, it certainly adds up. But I'm determined to be finished. And if you know me, I am a very determined and stubborn person. I'm definitely going to be relieved when I publish the finale, which I'm going to do in one sitting, no matter how long it takes. And hopefully I'll be able to get that out in a couple of weeks. So if you care about the future of our species and our planet, I'd love to connect with you. So please follow me on all of these different social media channels. Please come and join the Facebook group 1 Billion People with Uncommon Courage. And let's come together to create a global community committed to action. 1 billion people acting and driving change can create the human tipping point we need. Once we reach 1 billion people, we only need each person to recruit 3 to 4 people each, and then we will have enough people to be in a position to drive the runaway changes required. We also have to believe we can do it, and then we all need to get to work. See you for the next one, where we're going to focus on the mega crisis that is the waste crisis. And always remember, when it comes to the climate emergency, we decide, or nature decides. Regardless, a decision will be made and nature will win. See you for the next one.